Okay, so we're finally ready to get started. And it's a pleasure and an honor for me to introduce Beata Javorcik. Uh, okay. It's a pleasure and an honor for me to introduce Beata Javorcik. She is originally from Poland, and that makes it particularly meaningful because we are here in Central Europe, and she's a testament to what talent this region has and what that talent can achieve on a global stage. She's one of the main European economists. She's highly accomplished. She is the first woman to be a statutory professor at the University of Oxford, which is a major accomplishment. And now she is in Zurich as the chief economist of the European Bank of Reconstruction and Development. But she's also someone that has done lots of work that is interesting for our community. She has worked extensively on spillovers and the role that FDI plays on bringing and shifting the location of knowledge. So I think there's a lot that we can learn from her while she's here. First through her keynote, but hopefully also then through interactions throughout the conference. So please join me on welcoming Beata Javorcik.
Thank you, Cesar, for this very generous introduction. It's fantastic to be back in Budapest. I actually spent a year on sabbatical here in 2013. It's nice to be back at Codemys and be part of this conference. Just one correction, EBRD is in London, so not that far from us. I'm going to talk today about sanctions and the shifting landscape of international trade. And you may be wondering, why on earth should we talk about sanctions at the conference that's focusing on innovation and geography, or geography of innovation? That's, I think, it is the link between sanction and the topics of the conference is not that far. Why? First, because one of the key objectives of trade sanctions is to deprive the sanctioned economy of knowledge embodied in traded goods and to hamper its ability to innovate. So that's the first link. And the second link is that, as I will argue, trade sanctions have led to reshaping of trade. So there is the geographic component. So sadly, in the recent years, we've seen a proliferation of economic sanctions. And yet, I would argue that our understanding of sanctions is very limited. And to convince you of that, let me show you results of a survey conducted among academic economists. The survey is done by University of Chicago Booth School of Business. And a panel in Europe and a panel in the US is asked periodically to opine on different questions. And when these questions come, we need to express confidence. How confident are you about your answer? So here you see the results of a question that was asked in March 2022. This was literally 3 weeks after Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine. And economists were asked, do you agree that the economic and financial sanctions already in place will lead to a deep recession in Russia? And remember, sanctions were introduced very quickly. So by that time, already a lot has happened. And look, both in Europe and in the US, 90% of economists agreed or strongly agreed that sanctions would lead to a deep recession. And yet, 4 years on, this has not happened. Right? And I would argue that's because we have very limited understanding of sanctions. The literature on sanctions is growing very fast. But before before 2022, it was focusing mostly on official sanctions. It was focusing mostly on how the sanctions were inhibiting or not trade. But there are many other aspects of these restrictions that have not been explored. So first, we don't know enough about how sanctions are being circumvented. We have focused mostly on official sanctions, sanctions imposed by governments, but actually we have recently seen proliferation of private sanctions, self-imposed restrictions by firms. Sanctions, what matters is not only the primary sanctions, but also secondary sanctions, also concerns of firms about the reputation. And finally, implications of sanction can extend to other aspects, such as, for instance, what currency you use to settle your international trade transactions. So in my presentation, I'm going to focus on the recent episode of sanctions, so those that were imposed mostly by Europe and also the US on Russia after February 2022. And these sanctions were wide-ranging. But for the purposes of our discussion, what's going to matter is sanctions restricting trade exports to Russia. Now, these sanctions were in place already by end of March 2022, and they restricted exports of dual-use goods, so goods that could have military uses. They restricted exports of goods that could enhance Russian capacity to produce. So these were things like semiconductors, anything related to quantum computing, maritime navigation equipment, even steel pipes for use in pipelines. And third, they also restricted export of luxury goods. The other aspect of sanction that's going to matter for the purposes of our discussions is cutting off most of banks operating in Russia from the SWIFT messaging system, which makes it very difficult to conduct international financial transactions. Now, why was the literature until recently small and not particularly vibrant? Well, that's the reason that countries that were subject to sanctions typically were not very connected with other countries. These were often not very large economies. Russia is different. This episode of sanctions stands out in terms of how comprehensive they were and also how large the economy was. In 2021, Russia was the 11th largest economy in the world at market exchange rate. Okay, so let me set the scene just to give you a sense of what was happening. As sanctions hit, as Europe and actually US, Japan, 45 countries introduced sanctions restricted exports of the goods I mentioned to Russia, we saw a dramatic drop in European exports to Russia, right? And in case you're wondering why some trades of sanctioned goods still float, well, that's because firms were allowed to finish contracts, there were some exemptions, there was some grandfathering and so on and so forth. But look, as this dramatic drop in European exports to Russia happened, there was a big increase in European exports to Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, and Armenia. Right? And particularly enthusiastically, these countries imported sanctioned goods. And surprise, surprise, there was a big increase in exports from these countries to Russia of sanctioned goods. Now, of course, if you are eagle eye, you would notice that the scales are different on these graphs. So actually, this compensated for only this indirect export, this round tripping, compensated only for about a third of this dramatic drop in direct exports. Okay, what else was happening? Goods started getting lost in transit as they were traveling through the Russian territory. How do we know that? Well, we can take statistics. For instance, we can look at what Germany or France report as being exported to Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, and Armenia, and then we can look at what these countries report as imports from Germany, France, and so on. And here we graph the ratio of these statistics, right? And you can see that before 2022, they roughly matched, right? What Europe reported as being exported to CCA3 matched what CCA3 reported as being imported from Europe. There was one exception, that's luxury goods. Why? Because luxury goods are typically subject to excise taxes, tariffs, so importers always have an incentive to underreport, right? So it seems like that underreporting was happening. And then what happens when the war kicks in, suddenly goods start getting lost in transit, right? So essentially, on the customs declaration, you say these goods are going to Kyrgyzstan or Kazakhstan, and they are transiting via Russia, and they just simply never reach their destination. And that was particularly, enthusiastically used for industrial and dual-use goods, but also for luxury goods. And actually, what you can do is you can do an event study. I mean, I know this is very small. Triple differences. You can look at this discrepancy, comparing this discrepancy between what Europe says it exports to CCA3 versus Europe exports to the rest of the world before, after sanctions kick in, and for, this is dual use versus non-sanctioned goods, and this is industrial goods under sanction versus non-sanctioned. And you see that, goods get lost in transit. Interestingly, you see that in 2023, this effect becomes smaller. Why? Because the EU caught on what's happening, and basically I think the first quarter of the year prohibited that transit via Russia. Right? And then this prohibition for industrial goods happened only towards the end of 2023. Now, what else was happening? Well, as European, American exporters exited the Russian market, that created a vacuum, and nature abhors vacuum, so Turkey and China entered the Russian market. So essentially, there is what trade economists call, plain trade diversion. Somebody else supplies the market. But of course, you could argue that the goods that are coming from Turkey or Russia, these are not goods with the same technological content. And actually, we have looked at comparing goods under Western trademarks versus goods under trademarks from non-Western countries, and you see that in general, Russia has seen a much more pronounced drop in imports of goods under Western trademarks. And if you believe that Western trademark goods are goods with higher technological content, then this is depriving Russia of access to knowledge. Okay. So we've seen two ways of circumventing sanction. One is you simply go via intermediary country. The other one is, you ship via the sanctioned country and goods fall off the truck along the way. But, no presentation these days is complete without, AI, machine learning. So this is our attempt at this, and this is joint work with Alex and Max. And what we try to do is to see whether machine learning can help us shed some light at sanction evasion. So what can you do if you are an entity that is exporting from a Western European country and you don't want to be seen as exporting sanctioned goods to a sanctioned country, right? It's illegal to do that. And there are legal consequences. So what can you do? Well, you can misclassify your products, right? So X-ray machines for medical use are not subject to sanctions, but X-ray machines for use in industry are. So you can simply just use a different code, and you can say, I am exporting X-ray machines for medical use but while in reality you are exporting X-ray machines for industrial use that are subject to sanctions. So what we try to do is we try to train machine learning model to take the product description that's entered in the customs declaration and then predict the product code. What's the product code? And then to check whether it matches the product code that was actually stated in customs declaration. And what we are wondering is the accuracy of prediction deteriorating after sanctions kicking. And moreover, we are interested in what we call red flags. That cases where our model predicts that a sanctioned goods is being traded, while what the customs declaration says is something else. It says a non-traded good is being traded according to the code. Okay, So goods, so customs declaration contain descriptions of the good on average. So mean and median is 21 words. So these are fairly exhaustive descriptions. We are using the granularity of 6-digit HS codes. And HS stands for harmonized system. This is harmonized trade classification used by all countries in the world. About 5,000 products. So it's actually quite detailed, right? And you can see, input or output devices, whether or not incorporating memory units in the same housing. So these are fairly strong descriptions, and these are examples code, right? So what we do is we use transaction level data on Russian imports. So these are essentially from customs declarations. So we know, who is importing. We see the product description. We see the code. We see the value, and so on and so forth for 2016, 2023. And then we use the first 2 years of the data to train the model. Then we do some calibration on 2018, and then we apply it to 2019 through 2023 and see how it does. Well, the model, I don't have time to go in detail. It performs reasonably well. So on average, 64% of transactions in the full sample are identified correctly. But look, what happens? So this is our end of our calibration period. This is January 2019. Our model is doing okay. And look, suddenly when sanctions kick in, the predictive power of our model drops. And voila, look, it drops particularly for goods coming from sanctioning economies, right? So now we need to stop and think a bit about incentives. If I am an exporter from a sanctioning economy and I am exporting a sanctioned good, I don't want anybody to know that, right? I have every incentive to conceal my illegal behavior. If I am a Russian customs official processing this transaction, I don't care, right? I actually only care to the extent that there may be a difference in tariff rate, right? And if I am an exporter from a neutral economy, I also don't care because my country is not participating in sanction. Nobody cares what I am exporting. Now, what we can do here, we can also do triple differences. So we can look at the level of product coming from a particular partner country in a particular month. And we can ask, is there particular deterioration in accuracy of the model for goods coming from sanctioning countries after sanctions kick in, if these are goods that are subject to sanctions, right? And we can have, product partner country fixed effect, we can have country time, we can have product time, so we can sort of saturate this. So what do we see is after sanctions kick in, for products coming from sanctioning economies, accuracy of the model goes down by 3.5 percentage points, and additional, almost 3.5 for products that are subject to sanctions. Right? And you can, with different fixed effects, you get the same message. Then what we can do is we can look at red flags. Right? What are red flags? The model says the description of the product predicts that this product should be subject to sanctions, but actually in the customs declaration a non-sanction code is entered, and you see there is an increase in red flags for trade coming from sanctioning economies, you can do this via regression, you can do an event study, and you can see that this is happening. So far, what I've tried to convince you is that there is sanction circumvention that has been taking place. It has been taking place via transshipment, particularly through Central Asia Caucasus, through misspecifying the final destination of goods, so claiming that goods are going to the Caucasus countries, while in reality they never leave Russia, through which they are transiting. These two channels compensated for about 1/3 of the drop in European exports to Russia. And then there is the third channel, trade of circumvention, which is you specify the item you are exporting. Okay, now let's focus on something else, on private sanctions. This is the same team of authors. So, what is different about this recent episode of sanctions is that it's not only governments that have imposed sanctions, but firms have taken it upon themselves to leave the market, to restrict their own activities in a sanctioned country. Why are they doing this? Well, they are worried about their reputation. They are worried about secondary sanctions. They want to signal certain values to their customers. And actually, there's a project at Yale by Sonnenfeld and co-authors who have collected very detailed information on public announcement by firms with respect to their attitudes to supplying the Russian market. And what they say is that more than 1,000 companies employing over 1 million Russians chose to leave Russia in the first few months after the 2022 invasion. And I'm sure you have seen in the press lots of these announcements back then, from McDonald's, Chanel, Prada, to Apple and Mercedes-Benz. Now, are firms right in thinking that it matters, right, how they behave? There is a nice paper in the Economic Policy by Hartz, Delibotti and Company, and they conducted an online survey of 3,000 Americans. It's a representative sample. And what they found is that 61% of respondents agreed that doing business in Russia is like being an accomplice of the war. The company should sever its ties to Russia, whatever the consequences. Right? It's actually quite interesting that the customers are not very forgiving, right? No matter what it costs you, you should do it. And in this paper, they actually elicit this information in sort of various ways, asking people, what if you are an owner, what if you are a shareholder, what if you are a customer? And actually they conclude that only a minority of respondents agrees with Milton Friedman that the business of business is business. Right? So firms, these 1,000 firms that chose to impose restrictions on themselves voluntarily are actually onto something. But of course, not everybody did this. Raiffeisen, Austrian bank, chose to remain in Russia, making $1 billion in profit in 2023. Auchan, French retail chain, also remained. And they actually did a lot of bad press for them. So what we ask in this paper is, do Western multinationals follow their public announcements? So did they do what they said? Was there sanction circumvention? Right. So in the first, did they do what we say? We look at imports of their products. Is it really true that their products are not going to the Russian market? Then we ask, do we see that their products are reaching the Russian market via third countries? So some sort of circumvention. And then we ask, what's the price of values? So again, we use the same data that I mentioned, so transaction level data on Russian imports, 2016-2023. What is interesting about the data is that information on trademark under which goods are sold is collected. Right? That's not something that's typically collected in trade data. So we can distinguish a Huawei phone from an iPhone in the data. We know the origin country, we know the trading country. So here, when I talk about partner country, I will focus on the trading country, meaning the country where the business partner is located, where your business partner with whom you're doing this. And then the information on trademarks will allow us to match the import data to the public announcements made by firms collected by Sonnenfeld and Company. And we are able to use information on almost 1,700 of Western trademarks. So we focus only on Western trademarks here. And what's the share of imports we are capturing? It's about a third of imports before the war. Another third is generic goods, so non-trademark goods, and another third is trademarks from neutral countries and much sort of smaller trademarks that would not be captured in the Sonnenfeld list. Now, the Sonnenfeld list, they were unable to collect information on everybody, so they came up with some criteria. So first, this had to be big firms. These firms had to be present in Russia and some other country. They had to have a verifiable presence in Russia. So they had to essentially have some sort of manufacturing or distribution center. And by looking at press announcement, they classified these firms as firms that decided to withdraw from the market. So that was 470 firms, such as Mercedes, Toyota, Hewlett Packard. And then they defined this withdrawing as, you leave no operational footprint, you're gone. The second group that we focus on is, we call them scaling back. So these were firms that suspended almost all operations, but they did not exit. So that's Boeing, Hyundai, or Apple. Or firms that scaled back. So basically, they suspended a portion, but not all of operations. So General Electric or Linden. And then they were firms whom we call doing business as usual. So that would be, they pause new investments, but they continue operating their substantive business. And then there are firms that, Sonnenfeld called digging in, like Mitsubishi, that they do business as usual, right? So we'll use these three categories in our analysis. So what we are going to do is we are going to compare trade flows, so imports into Russia of goods coming under trademarks of withdrawing firms and scaling back. So firms in those two groups that made an announcement they are gone or they are scaling back, to a baseline category of firms that chose business as usual. So our outcome will be imports into Russia of product P under trademark R imported in month T. Right? So we are going to be distinguishing between Huawei phone and iPhone, right? Or Samsung printer and brother printer, right? And then we are asking, is there a change in trade flows after sanctions kick in for trademarks of firms that chose withdrawal or scaling back relative to the baseline category of goods of firms who chose to do business as usual? And we have product trademark fixed effects, right? So we account for the fact that Russia may be importing more Huawei phones than iPhones. We have product time fixed effect, meaning that our identification compares imports of the same good phone of owners who had different attitude to sanctions. So when we do this, what do we find? We find essentially an 80% drop in imports of goods bearing trademarks of withdrawing firms relative to those pursuing business as usual, and 30% drop in imports of firms that chose to scale back. And we can do it as a 0-1. Does the flow exist? We can do it as a hyperbolic sign. So that means we also captured the extensive margin, so zeros are included, or we can do PPM. That does not matter much. Note that how do we know, do these private sanctions add to official sanctions? And the answer is yes, because you find these results even if you focus on non-sanctioned goods. Right? So there is no reason why these firms should not be selling non-sanctioned goods to Russia unless they are worried about something like reputation or something like signaling values to their customers. So you see that even if you look at products that are not sanctioned, you see the same pattern. Now, what you see reported in the press is the fact that despite these brand names leaving Russia, these products are still available for sale in Russia, and there are people writing papers on it. And quite recently, Financial Times was talking about Zara's clothing. Zara, many of you may know, Spanish brand. Their parent company withdrew from Russia, and yet their products, even including Zara tags, are available for sale there. Well, how is that possible? Well, an entrepreneurial person can go to a third country and just simply purchase goods from Zara and ship them to Russia. So what we also look at is what is the share of trade. So let's say iPhones versus Huawei phones coming, in March 2023 that are shipped, that come from neutral destinations. So essentially, we look at what is the share of those products that are purchased from partner firms in non-sanctioning countries. And you can see that, for firms that are withdrawing, this share goes up by 20 percentage points, right? So as these firms are not longer supplying the Russian market, somebody else is bringing these goods. Now, we don't know whether it's done with or without the knowledge of these firms. Actually, Russia announced promotion of parallel imports, meaning imports done without the authorization of the trademark owner. So this can be done with or without the knowledge these imports can come. Now, you may be worried that firms withdraw because of poor performance in Russia, right? So they're saying we are leaving because they were worried about boycott. So we think about that by having an IV approach, and essentially using the logic that if you are a publicly traded firm, you are under greater scrutiny, under greater pressure. And when we do IV, we get very, this is a good predictor of whether you leave. And then we have results very similar. We lump withdrawing and scaling firms together. Let me skip the IV. Now, final question, what is the price of values? Right? How much does it cost you to impose these private sanctions on yourself? So we take our IV estimate and, being trade economists, we convert it into tariff equivalent. So in other words, we ask, what kind of tariff would precipitate the same drop in exports to Russia? Now, if you want to do this transformation, you need to assume something about trade elasticity. There is a range of elasticities in the literature, and hence you have the range of plus values. But essentially, the price of values is, it's equivalent to facing an additional tariff between 7 and 29%, depending on what elasticity you assume. So, to summarize this, private sanctions seem to be reinforcing official sanctions. They seem to restrict access of non-sanctioned goods to a sanctioned economy. There is some transshipment or some parallel imports coming from neutral countries that attenuates the impacts of the sanction. And the price of values is substantial, right? It's equivalent to a fairly significant tax. Okay. Next thing we can look at is, well, what about third countries? Right? So remember, I showed you that as direct exports from Europe dropped, right? There was this round tripping, but there was also entry of exporters from another country, namely Turkey and China. So here we will look at Turkey, and in other words, we'll take the perspective of a third country. So from the Turkish perspective, there is suddenly this vacuum, this drop in competition that happens in the Russian market. And now firms in Turkey have a choice. They can use this business opportunity and perhaps make bigger profits, but they have to worry about the reputation, perhaps possibility of secondary sanction, perhaps the risk of non-payment because it's always risky to do business with a country or war. And perhaps higher transaction costs, right? Remember that the Russian banks have been cut off from the SWIFT system. So here, we looked both using theory and empirics at this trade-off between the business opportunity versus these heightened risks. What are secondary sanctions? Secondary sanctions is a situation where a country that imposes sanctions wants to punish entities from another country for supplying the sanctioned country. So, it's complicated. So it's easiest to explain with an example. When the US reinstated sanctions against Iran, it was punishing non-US firms, non-US citizens who were supplying Iran, right? So it is sort of extraterritorial behavior. And US sanctions are scary because the most severe punishment is the loss of access to the US financial system, right? Because essentially US can prevent you from doing business in US dollars, essentially. Okay, so here we use very similar data to those before. We use transaction level data on Turkish imports globally, 2021 to 2023. We know the product, we know the destination country, we know the payment method, we also know currency that was used. And we know also a lot about these firms because we can link customs data to a registry of firms. What is important for the purposes of our discussion is that Turkey was not participating in sanctions. So if you are a Turkish firm sitting there, you're supplying Russia, you're selling dual-use goods, you're not violating any rules. Right. Now, if you are an affiliate of a Western multinational, then the situation is more tricky because if somebody could prove that you are using that affiliate to go around sanctions, then you're in trouble. Right? But there are, of course, other considerations. You may be worried that you will upset Washington and the US will impose secondary sanctions on you. Or you may be worried about your reputation, right? Just like we talked a few minutes ago. So what we do is we look at, very simple, diff at the level of firm, exported product. Here it's even greater granularity. It's 8-digit products to a given country in a given month, right? And we are asking, have things changed when exports are going to Russia versus other countries before, after sanctions? So we have firm product destination fixed effects, right? So identification comes from changes over time. So it's a Turkish firms exporting widgets to Russia versus Turkish firms exporting widgets to Germany. Now, what do we see is after the war starts, there is almost a 30% increase in the value of trade from Turkey to Russia. Note, this is at the level of firm product, right? So this is sort of the average effect for a firm. Note that we can do it in quantities. It's slightly higher for values than for quantities, which tells you that prices are going up. You can do an event study, and this is exactly what you see. This is February 2022. That's when the war starts. In March, there is drop in exports, big uncertainty, and then slowly exports are going up, ramping up, and staying at this high level. Is everybody behaving differently? So in other words, are foreign affiliates of Western multinationals operating in Turkey behaving differently? The answer is yes, right? They are, while everybody else is increasing exports to Russia by 30%, their increase on their part is much, much smaller, right? Is it the fear of secondary sanctions, or is it concern about reputation? Well, one way we can get at this question, we don't know what's in their minds, right? But because we see that there is the same pattern for non-sanctioned goods. So if they are selling non-sanctioned goods, nobody can come after them for violating sanctions. That is very suggestive of reputational effects. And here you can see that it's not only that they are not increasing export, they are actually shrinking their exports to Russia. And it's only affiliates of Western multinationals. Affiliates of multinationals from other countries are behaving the same way as Turkish firms. Now, I mentioned, other risks, right? So, what are other margins of adjustment? It is much harder for Russian firms, for Russian importers, to process transactions in Western currencies. Right? Most banks have been cut off from the SWIFT system, so you see that there is a decline in the share of transactions that are done in euros and in dollars. It's roughly 5 percentage point decline. There is an increase in transactions denominated in Turkish lira. Interestingly, affiliates of Western multinationals are shunning lira, right? They don't want to do lira. Now, if you have been following, what has been happening to Turkish lira, you would know, there was inflation 90%, there was sort of a big roller coaster. So most business people would be careful about being paid in lira, and these exporters are because they are demanding cash in advance. So there was a 5% increase so in the share of value that was going on cash in advance terms, right? They are getting paid upfront, there is no risk to them. What they are also doing is they are enjoying higher markups. So here you can look at plain unit values. So unit value, that's value divided by quantity. So these goods unit values go up after the war starts, right? So remember, we are comparing before, after the war, going to Russia versus other countries. Or we can, through essentially various ways of demeaning, we can get at, proxy for markups, and we can see that markups are going up. But interestingly, if you think about this, markups are going up by 4 percentage points. That is not actually very much, right? So that's not hurting. That means that the impact of sanctions is not hurting as much as one would think. And again, we can do a tariff equivalence. We can say these Western firms that are not exporting, that are not using this business opportunity, what's the tariff equivalent of that? And here, because they drop their exports, tariff equivalent can be anywhere from 25% to over 300. So basically, what we argue in the paper is that reputational risks and threat of secondary sanctions weigh on export decisions of particularly Western multinationals, both on the intensive and extensive margin. I mean, we have many more exercises, but I don't want this presentation to be death by tables. One final study. Let's look at currencies that are used to denominate transactions. So what has happened? Sanctions cut off majority, not all, banks operating in Russia from the SWIFT system. Also, Russian reserves have been frozen, right? You may remember the discussion about 200 billion parked in Euroclear in Brussels. What that has done, it has sent chills down the spines of countries not aligned with the West, thinking, am I going to be next? Right? And that revived discussion about creating an alternative currency, in particular BRICS currency. Now, we are nowhere close to having a BRICS currency, but look what has happened. When you look at SWIFT data, you see that after 2022, there was a big increase in the share of transactions, trade transactions denominated in the Chinese currency, in renminbi. It's very small, right? It's 6%, but the trend here is quite strong. And note that because a lot of Russian trade is not going via SWIFT, this would be an underestimation. So in this paper, what we do is we looked at who is using what currency to invoice trade with Russia. And we can just graph Russian imports. This is raw data that's color-coded. Color-coded, so Russian imports from everywhere, color-coded by currency. This is the same thing, just expressed as shares. What do we see? The blue part, so actually maybe it's easier to start with gray part. Gray part, these are exports coming from the Eurozone and from the US. So these are exports that are denominated in either euros or dollar, right? So, their share goes down because, this trade is drying out. Then we can look at the blue part, exports denominated in US dollar, but coming from other countries, right? So US dollar as a so-called vehicle currency, you see a dip. Then you see this big light blue part. This is China. These are exports coming from China denominated in renminbi. And then the orange part is interesting. Third countries using renminbi to trade with Russia. And then there is red. This is, Turkish lira or Indian rupee. When you look at trade in vehicle currency, so that means that this is not the ruble or not the currency of the country of exporting, you see that the share of US dollar goes down, and now renminbi accounts for 12% of these transactions, right? So it's becoming more prominent as an international currency of invoicing and settlement. So in this paper, we look at what's driving the choice of currency. So we look at geopolitical alignment. If you are a party to sanctions, you may be behaving differently than if you are a non-sanctioning country. So neutral countries may prefer using non-Western currencies. Second, payment infrastructure. People's Bank of China extends swap lines to central banks in other countries, and that makes it easier for firms in those countries to do business in renminbi. Right, so that can matter. So I'm going to talk about these two. In the paper, we also look at whether fear of secondary sanctions matters. So basically, if you do transaction in US dollars, at some point it touches the US financial system, it leaves a trace. If you are worried about sanctions because you are trading a sanctioned good, you may not want to leave a trace. And we find some support for that. You may be, the choice of currency may matter whether you're a big trader or small trader. So we show that Russian firms that are big, that trade a lot, they will use Western currency. Small firms, new firms will not. So let me remind you who the sanctioning countries are. When Russia invaded Ukraine, 141 countries condemned the invasion at the UN General Assembly. Only 45 countries signed up for sanctions. Essentially, it's the European Economic Area, US, Japan, New Zealand, Canada, Switzerland, and UK, of course. So what we look at is we look at Russian transaction level data, so we know which firm is importing what product from which partner country in which month. So this is transaction level data at monthly granularity. And we ask, what is the share of a particular currency, right? So we can look at the share of renminbi. So we use trade from everywhere, share of US dollar. So here we are excluding the US because we are interested in US dollar being used as a vehicle currency. Share of euro as a vehicle, so we exclude trade with Eurozone. Other producer currencies, so we exclude US, Eurozone, China, and ruble. And then because renminbi is a own currency for China and a vehicle currency for others, we allow for different interactions. So essentially we ask, are you changing the currency? Is there a change in currency that's being used if imports are coming from a neutral country after the war starts. And the answer is yes. When you look at imports coming from China, at the level of very granular importing farm product partner country month, you see there is a drop in the use of US dollar, roughly 22%, offset by switch to renminbi. You see smaller but similar magnitude for trade coming from neutral countries, and we are comparing it to trade coming from sanctioning economies. Right, and you can do it you can kill the firm dimension, you can aggregate this, and you get much bigger results. So what does it mean? Essentially, we see fragmentation of currencies being used. This is just pictures, the raw data. Goods farming comes from China. It used to be that 90% of trade from China was denominated in US dollar. Now 90% is in renminbi. When you look at trade coming from neutral countries, the share of trade denominated in US dollar dropped rapidly, and you see more orange, that's renminbi, and you see more red, these are own currencies, Turkish lira, Indian rupee, dirham from UAE. When you look at trade with sanctioned economies, much less action. Now, the second thing we look at is, does payment infrastructure matter, right? So there is a literature which argues that you can use swap lines to promote your currency. So People's Bank of China has these swap line agreements with other central banks. The way it works is the Chinese send certain amount of money in renminbi to a given central bank. This central bank is obliged to return the money as pre-specified amount, typically 3 years later. So there is no uncertainty about exchange rate because it's all pre-agreed, and there is some sort of small fee for that. But it's all pre-agreed. So, you get the money today, you return given amount in 3 years. What that means is that the central bank can lend to local firms in that currency. It can exchange currency, that local firms that want to do business in renminbi suddenly don't face exchange rate uncertainty. So that makes it much more attractive to do business in renminbi. And look, here are some countries that have the swap line. So for instance, Pakistan, Mongolia, Thailand, South Africa, also Luxembourg, Malaysia, Indonesia, Chile, South Korea, Singapore. Right? And we ask, is the renminbi share going up after war starts, particularly for countries that have swap lines with People's Bank of China? And we do it for all countries, or we split it into neutral countries versus sanctioning countries. And what you see is that for trade coming from neutral countries after the war starts, there is an increase in usage of renminbi if your country has a swap line with PBOC. When we sort of kill the firm dimension and aggregate the data, the increase is roughly 12 percentage points. And you can see it in the raw data. These are neutral economies with swap lines, and those without. The orange part is bigger here. So to summarize this part, there has been a big shift in currencies that are being used to invoice trades around Russia. So it's a fragmentation of currencies happening as a result of sanctions. A particular winner is the renminbi. And so, one implication of these results is that while the dominance of the US dollar makes sanctions more effective, actually sanctions in the long run may discourage the use of the US dollar. Let me circle back to our profession. Have economists updated their views of sanctions? All right, so here is the survey. Again, this is Chicago Booth, when they asked, past experience suggests that economic sanctions do little to deter the target countries from their course of action. Right? So essentially, sanctions don't do much. These are responses from 2014, where, most people, so not most, but many 40% of people disagreed. They said, no, we disagree with the fact that sanctions don't do anything. But now look at the same question asked in 2025, only 9% disagree. So economists seem to have updated their view of sanctions, thinking that sanctions matter less than what they thought before. Thank you.
Wow, thank you, Beata. That was an amazing presentation. It was extremely comprehensive, and I think that we probably have an audience that is brimming with questions. So, do we have any questions in the audience? Carolina?
Hi, thanks a lot for bringing this fresh perspective to our community. I have a question about your work on foreign multinationals living in Russia. So you talked about this side of the story, but I was wondering if you looked at the other side of the story. So what happened in the Russian market when these companies left? I remember seeing some pictures of new chains that had the same looks of the McDonald's and the Zara's, but with Russian names. So I was wondering if you looked also at the response in terms of new trademark registrations in Russia, or even trademark infringement cases brought by the multinationals to the Russian companies. So to what extent, if if someone believes also an optimistic narrative, this leading of companies create space for market development in Russia?
So, we don't have data from Russia. There are other people working on this, like Jamila Ningolina from Lausanne. What they are finding is after the 2014 sanction episode, firms that were hit by sanctions were compensated by the Russian government. But this is Russian firms. Now, you mentioned trademarks. We have looked at what happens to trademark registrations. So at the level of trademark registration, what you see, there is a big drop in Western firms registering trademarks in Russia after the war starts, and you don't see this drop, in other places. And you see also the reverse. Russian trademarks are not being registered in sanctioning countries. It's only for new registrations, not for renewals. And our conjecture is that firms are worried about losing their trademark due to non-use. So basically in Russia, after 3 years, if you don't use your trademark, you lose it, and there have been some prominent cases. So this uncertainty about how long the war will continue, this dissuades Western firms from registering trademarks in Russia. Now, you may ask whether do you care whether you register or not? There is a famous case, I think it was Dr. Pepper, that someone in Russia wanted to register Dr. Pepper, and the court said no, because that trademark was not registered in Russia. It was, a known trademark somewhere else. So actually firms are sort of being reasonable, being cautious, and worried about, there's someone else taking over the trademark.
Okay. For further questions, we also have a cube there that Esteban can throw around the room. So it's like a little pillow with a microphone. So I'll wait for some hands to raise. I also have a question, if I may indulge, or we have... Yeah. Okay, there's a question up there. Sorry, I didn't see. And then Ron up here. Wait for the microphone, please.
Zoltán, Hungary. Proximity matters in sanctions as well. My question goes for Central Eastern European countries. Is it any significant impact beyond energy sector on their GDC position, or even in the restructuration, whether they have been benefited to replacing some of the Russian suppliers or contacts within this global value chain? So what is the immediate impact or longer term impact on Central Eastern European EU member countries?
So I don't. So the short answer is we have not looked at this. My hunch is that for Central Europe, Russia was not a super important market when it comes to sanctioned goods. Of course, economies of Central European countries took a big hit after the war started. And this worked through two channels. The first channel was the energy shock, so the big jump in energy prices. And prices in Europe of natural gas were 5 times as high as in the US. So Europe in general became less competitive. And the second channel is via Germany. Germany has very energy intensive industry. That industry got hit very hard. And because Central European countries are very much integrated in German global value chains, that hurt very much. But it actually went beyond, automotive or sort of electric value chain. I talked to exporters of software from Romania who were hit because automakers cancelled the contracts. And the fact that Germany went into a recession, 2 years of shrinking GDP, meant that demand for exports for everything from food to furniture to Germany went down. So it was felt not just in Central Europe, also in Western Balkans, even in North Africa.
Ron, you had a question too, or yeah?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for your very inspiring talk. Really enjoyed it. I was wondering about your last comment about that economies seems to have changed their minds, right? About the effects of economic sanctions and the impacts on the target countries. I was wondering, have you had any reflections? Should we rewrite economic textbooks on international trade in that respect, right? Because if economists are so wrong about predicting something which should be their core business, is there something wrong with their theory?
Well, we have to rewrite all the textbooks. The late Queen Elizabeth of England visited the London School of Economics and famously asked, why haven't the economists predicted the global financial crisis? And people were scrambling for an answer, right? So we are not as good as we think. But actually, I think in the case of this episode of sanctions, expectations were unrealistic, right? Because first, if you cut off a country from supply of imports, what happens? Import substitution. That fuels employment growth. Second, if only 41 countries are participating in sanctions, and there are other major producing countries like China and Turkey that are not, then trade diversion will happen. And trade diversion is part of a sort of standard toolkit of trade economists. So perhaps, maybe economists were wrong because these were not just trade economists.
We have another question here, another question back there. Yeah. I guess the microphone is closer there, so we're gonna go there first and then we go to Tom. Throw it, Stefan. That's the whole point of the cube. Yeah, exactly.
Thanks so much for the presentation. It was very interesting. The data you show are clear in the sense that countries have circumvented the ban using other countries. So my question would be, actually it's more curiosity. First, have you checked with other kind of data if, for example, in logistics, now we have all satellite data, we have CO2 emission data, if the actual volume that was exported via Kyrgyzstan or Kazakhstan has changed through logistics, and whether this logistics has affected the GDP of these countries or labor.
So an excellent question. So the way we got into these studies was in the late 2022, we were doing economic projections at the EBRD for these countries. And suddenly, these economies were, growing very fast. And anecdotally, we were told by our colleagues that a lot of that was fueled by trade. So these are small, Armenia, Kyrgyzstan, these are very small countries. So, European exports to Kyrgyzstan going up 5 times, that fueled a lot of trade activity. So, at some point, Armenia was growing at, close to 10%. I mean, there was also another factor, Russians leaving Russia and going to Armenia, so we can't separate this. But you definitely saw the impact of trade in their GDPs.
Okay, and maybe we can try to get that cube all the way here. No, I have a microphone in my hand, so.
There is another mic.
There is another mic here. Okay, perfect. Yeah.
Thank you. Thanks a lot for the very interesting presentation. I was triggered by your last remark, not the last, but the previous to the last remark about the similarities to the financial crisis. Because in the end, isn't this very much about networks, right? So you could say that one of the causes for the financial crisis, why it was so hard to predict, was basically the limited understanding of the networks underlying the connections of banks. And here, looking at trade, it is also a network, right? So it is really hard to isolate a node in a network if you just cut a couple of the linkages, as long as there are alternative linkages basically are still existing. So the question is, would you say that this understanding of networks being a very important perspective to trade and finance has, because of these events, become more prominent in the, let's say, trade economists, but also wider economist profession?
So I mean, I agree with you that, transactions have become more complex, right? Whether we think about, packaging of secure mortgages into sort of complex financial instruments, or whether you think about trade networks. So I agree with you that the world is more complex, but I still think that, one could have predicted some of the circumvention here, as well as trade diversion, right? If there are big manufacturing countries that are outside of sanctions, trade diversion is bound to happen. There's also another issue, which is the issue of enforcement. And sanctions were introduced at the EU level, but enforcement was left to national authorities. And, every country has an incentive to want every other country to enforce sanctions, but has an incentive to be, more generous to its own exporters. So incentives were not aligned. And, we also saw it, during the Cold War, right? There were goods that were making their way to this part of the world despite sanctions. Actually, my colleague from Oxford, Steve Brodberry, who is an economic historian, wrote a book chapter on the history of sanctions. And his conclusion is that countries imposing sanctions have always been too optimistic about how well these sanctions would work.
Okay. And one last question before we go into the break. I thought that point on the optimism might have been a great place to stop, but
Yeah, okay. So thanks a lot. I'm just a bit sad that I cannot use that microphone with AI open soon. So thanks a lot. It was a fantastic talk, really, really interesting. The question is, just looks to a side direction, a bit interesting for some of the people in the community of, let's say, innovation. Like, do you have insights, or do you know about related studies that look at firms both in countries that, let's say, impose sanctions or that receive sanctions in this case Russia, in terms of their innovative behavior? Like, are they entering new HS classes? Are they patenting more? Are they patenting less? Because we have a lot of these insights about the China shock from the entrance on WTO. So the impact, positive shock, negative shock, depending on how you define it. But this one, not yet.
Well, I'm hoping that people in this room, right, will take up the challenge and try to shed light on how much sanctions have hampered, right, the ability of a sanctioning country to innovate, right? Because if you believe that there is knowledge that's embodied in goods that are no longer available, and if you believe that, you know, Chinese products are imperfect substitute for German products, and if you believe that multinationals do produce spillovers, right, particularly to their suppliers, then there is a cost of sanctions that should be visible in productivity statistics and in innovation statistics, right? So, you know, because of my EBRD jobs, journalists have always asked me, you know, are sanctions working? And my answer always has been, they are working, but they are working slowly, and they are working through the impact on productivity. But that's not something that's sort of easy, it's visible. And also they are working relative to the counterfactual, right? And people are not good at thinking about counterfactuals. You know, where would Russian innovation be today had the war not happened, right? But that's something I'm hoping someone in this room can look at.
Thank you.
Okay, so we have our speaker again. Big round of applause for Beata. Thank you. And now we have a break. We're gonna be back at 11:15 a.m. And there's coffee on the 3rd floor, 2nd floor, and the 1st floor. So you can hop around the building and see you in half an hour.